Gene Shepard was an American radio and TV personality, a writer, and actor who went by the nickname Shep. Shepard grew up in Hammond, Indiana, served in the Army Signal Corps during World War II, and after his discharge started a career in radio that would provide a platform for his legendary storytelling. These stories would be the ingredients that would take Gene Shepard through a journey that would encompass radio, literature, theater, television, and eventually culminate into one of the most celebrated holiday movies of all time, A Christmas Story. In 1981, the city of Hammond honored Gene Shepard with the Hammond Achievement Award. In 2005, Gene Shepard was inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame, and in 2012, his movie A Christmas Story gained inclusion into the National Film Registry in the Library of Congress. Who was Gene Shepard? Where did he come from? What made him special? Why was he always stirring things up? Let's take a look into this man's life and career to get a better understanding of why this man has been called a genius by some and a phony by others. Gene Shepard was born in Chicago, Illinois on July 26, 1921. He was raised just over the state line in Hammond. He lived with his father, Gene, and mother, Ann, along with his younger brother, Randall, at 2907 Cleveland Street, which would become the backdrop to many of Gene Shepard's popular childhood stories. He attended the Warren G. Harding Elementary School and went on to graduate from Hammond High School in 1939. After graduation, Shepard served in the U.S. Army Signal Corps during World War II, becoming proficient with radio signals and Morse code, building on his amateur radio hobby he picked up as a teenager. After the war, Shepard headed back to Hammond, passing on opportunities to work in the steel mills, and instead took a position at WJOB, a tiny radio station in Hammond where Gene called in the high school sports scores during his high school years, an act that would eventually begin Shepard's career in radio. For most of his career, Gene Shepard worked in radio. Shepard's first radio job at WJOB lasted about a year before he went off briefly to work at a station in Toledo, Ohio. He then headed to Cincinnati, where he would work at a few different stations for nearly 5 years, before heading east to Philadelphia for a couple more years, only to find himself back in Cincinnati for 2 more. Shepard's main duty as a radio disc jockey was to play records on the air, but the young wide-eyed Shep couldn't stop talking in between records, which would often get him in trouble with station management.
You know, the old story is that Shep was fired by every station in Cincinnati. That's not necessarily true. He was only fired by about three or four.
He was legendary for wanting to talk, and he was on a station, a 50,000 watt station, WCKY, and the owner came in after a shift and said, "Are you ever going to stop talking?" And Shep said no, and he said, "Well, you're fired."
Gradually, Shepard developed and mastered a different type of show than the rest of the on-air personalities. He developed monologues for his show, where he would spend the entire time on the air talking to whoever was listening. Then, in 1955, Shepard headed east one more time, this time to join New York's powerful WOR 710 AM, where he would spend the next 22 years of his radio career entertaining tens of thousands of listeners every night with humorous stories about his childhood or working in the steel mills or the not-so-glamorous side of the Army to the New York way of life compared to the rest of the world. Shep's monologues opened the eyes of his listeners and lit a light bulb in their heads by describing the ordinary things of life and how they played a much larger role in the big picture of life. Even though Shepard had a wide-ranging audience, many young teenagers tuned in every night to hear these stories, maybe because someone who had already been there before was telling it like it really is. Every show was different, and the listener never knew what to expect.
And like a lot of other people at night, I would scan the radio. It had knobs. In those days, radios had knobs. And I would scan the radio, and I'd be listening, and I'd hear Frank Sinatra, then I'd hear a classical music station, then I'd hear a news broadcast, and then all of a sudden I came across this voice. And it was a voice of somebody I had never heard. But he was telling this wonderful story about working in a steel mill in Hammond, Indiana. And he said, "You know what it's really like to work in a steel mill in the summer? Do you know what that's like? I bet none of you have experienced what I've experienced." And I stayed there. And like a sorcerer, he brought me in. He seduced me into his world at that moment. And from then on, I listened to him every night on WOR, where he was doing these long monologue shows interspersed with music. And every night was different. He'd create a different adventure. in your mind. And I imagined what this man looked like. I couldn't conceive of what he looked like because he was this anonymous voice coming out of the radio, but captivating me in a way that no one else had ever done. But even more so, the ability to draw you in. In other words, once you were listening to Gene, there was no way you could stop because he was like a drug. I think that's a good way to describe him. He had a way with his voice, with his intonation, where he took you down this beautiful path with all its intricacies and little side trips, but he knew exactly where he was going all the time. It was like a mission.
It was during this time that Gene found himself in the middle of a world of rising counterculture and social experimentation, and New York had imported another leader of the cause, and Gene Shepard was at the right place at the right time. Shepard has been credited with coining the term night people and being ahead of his time by introducing flash mobs or crowdfunding through his radio shows by getting audiences involved, using his radio show to reach out to each listener.
All of a sudden, my life changed. Here was Gene Shepard, and it was a Saturday afternoon, and he was talking about all those on the beach. If you're listening, wave your towel. He did that a lot, if you're driving, blink your light, dim your lights and put them back on, whatever it was, change it from what it is, but let everybody know that we're together. And I figured, who in the world? I could tell whoever he was, we didn't have the likes of him in North Carolina.
Shepard also used his influence on the radio to create a crowdfunding effort by helping independent filmmaker and friend John Cassavetes fund his landmark 1959 film Shadows by having his listeners call in and contribute $5 each. During the early years of his radio career, Shepard was always searching for other means to get his stories told. Close friend Shel Silverstein was instrumental in introducing Gene Shepard into the world of literature. Silverstein had been working with the newly published Playboy magazine as a contributing cartoonist and correspondent. Silverstein introduced Shepard to Playboy publisher Hugh Hefner, and Hefner took a liking to Shepard's humorous writing style, describing the stories of growing up in the Midwest. Gene Shepard contributed 24 articles to Playboy and went on to win several humorous writer awards, including the Mark Twain Humor Award for writing in 1976. But it was Shepard's first novel, In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash, that would be the key for Shepard to get those larger audiences he so eagerly desired. Gene Shepard began dabbling with television during his days in Cincinnati with a short ad-lib show called Rear Bumper, where Gene would talk about various topics, but usually one of his childhood stories.
There's some talk, of course, in Gene's history about the TV program Rear Bumper, which was on WLWT. I think the idea of Rear Bumper was Gene's. He had it in mind that he wanted to do something on television. I think that he had attempted that at KYW, but they didn't buy into it. So when he did return to Cincinnati, it wasn't too long before he was doing the television thing, in addition to some radio announcing duties. That was his primary reason for being hired.
Although the show did not take off, it did give Shepard a taste of the ever-growing medium of television and its vastly growing audience that he seemed to desire. During the 1960s, after establishing himself as one of the top radio talents in New York, Shepard began to make a few appearances on national television as a guest on a couple of talk shows. Shepard also starred in a couple of smaller film projects, but it wasn't until the early 1960s that a breakthrough came with a letter Shepard received from Fred Barzik, a budding television producer in the Boston area who took a liking to Shepard's style of storytelling.
I had never heard of Gene Shepard. I mean, I was totally non-Shepard. And one day I was in Boston taking care of my year-old son, and I turned the radio, and on came this voice. And he was talking to me, and he was talking, and no music. He was just talking. And what's he talking? He's talking about inland steel, and about how he had to deliver the mail, and he was climbing up, and it was icy, and he almost fell down, and then one of the cars exploded, and one man died, and I said, my God, I got to work with this guy. This is the person I've been looking for. I've never heard about him, and he grew up 100 miles away from where I did. He's living the life that I had. So, being young, impetuous, I wrote him a letter and offered him a free half hour of television time. That was 1961. I never told management. I figured what the hell, he probably was going to say no, but at least I'd have a chance to talk to him, and maybe, you know, he said yes. I flipped. He said yes. Now what? I had to go to management and say, see, I have invited this guy. He's a what? Well, he's a humorist. You mean he tells jokes? No, no, no. He's a humorist. He tells stories. And he's really good. And you really, seriously, all right, we'll give you a half hour, such and such a day. You get one camera, and that's it. No editing, no nothing. So Shepard shows up. First time I ever met him. And he had crew cuts. And he had this woman with him by the name of Lee, who I think was like his assistant. And I said, I've got the camera set up outside overlooking the Charles River. Is that okay? And I only have one camera. So your titles are going to be on this card, and then we'll pan to you, and then you talk for a half hour. We'll give you 2 minutes and 1 minute, and when you're done, we'll pan back for the close. Is that okay? Yeah, fine, no problem, no problem. Okay, we go. Roll the camera, roll tape, cue him. His theme song, he brought it on a cassette. We played his theme song. Camera pans to Shepard, and he goes, well, fellow Americans, fellow travelers on the yellow brick road of life, how are you doing? And he went on to tell the story about being a kid in Hammond and finding the silver lining still in the Ovaltine bottle. And he could get the magic decoder ring. And the magic decoder ring said, you should keep drinking Ovaltine. He duped as a 10-year-old. Then he told the blind date story where he took this girl out because his aunt or his mother said you should take this girl out, and he thought he found out he was the blind date. Show ends, pan over. My crew say, hey, this is better than all the shows we've been doing for the Navy. I mean, metallurgy and trigonometry and geometry. I mean, this is fun.
Barzyk worked for PBS member station WGBH in Boston, where he would produce Gene Shepard's America. With the success of his PBS TV series, Gene Shepard began to set his sights on a format that had been eluding him, a medium that would allow Shepard to share his humorous stories to an even larger audience, the silver screen. Gene Shepard had a goal to have his stories make it to the big screen and shown in movie theaters around the world. The popularity of Shepard's book, In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash, gave Shepard that chance. Movie director Bob Clark had just come off the box office movie hit Porky's, about a group of high school teenagers in the 1950s. Soon afterward, while driving to a date, Bob Clark heard Shepard on the radio and suddenly had the urge to reach out to him.
From what I was told, Bob heard Gene Shepard as he was driving, and he was on his way to pick up a date in Coral Gables, Florida, and was mesmerized by the story of Flick's tongue, which we all now know because Scott Schwartz, touched his tongue to the prop. And Bob became fixated on Gene Shepard's voice and Gene Shepard's storytelling capabilities, and drove around and picked up a very irate date at the, after being very deterred listening to Gene Shepard's voice, but said, I want to make a movie based on this guy's stories. It took us several years for this to come into fruition, but ultimately Bob went to Gene's house and said, I'm a big fan. I want to do this. And Gene invited him in and said, let's talk and tell me, what do you love? What resonates with you? Why do you want to do this? And at the end of that evening, with Bob Clark showing up unsolicited to Gene Shepard's house, they had a tacit agreement that they were going to work on this. So again, it really came down to both of them having such a willingness to do something different and to do something that they felt was important because these stories deserve to be told. And they were both right.
Gene Shepard claimed that it was the theater that took him to New York, where he had dabbled in a few Broadway productions. He claimed that he was on a path to be a serious actor in the theater and the movies. Ironically, Shepard did indeed find himself back in the theater. Unfortunately, it would come after his death. With the success of the movie version of A Christmas Story, theaters across the country now have a chance to produce their very own production of A Christmas Story. There is A Christmas Story the play and A Christmas Story the musical that opened to rave reviews in Chicago and in New York in 2012 and 2013.
Now, I have a theory that I've evolved over the years, and that is that people who never discover their vulnerability never go on to do anything. They continue to do whatever it is they've always done all their life. something because they have never been reminded of their mortality. How many guys thought that they would be working at the steel mill for maybe 300-400 years? Well into the 28th century, they'd still be going to the 40-inch soaking pits. Oh, Jesus. I worked in inland steel, by the way. They used to scare me. God, I'd walk down through the 40-inch soaking pits. This was a scene right on. How many of you guys ever worked in the steel mill? Okay, you know what the 40-inch soaking pits were? Okay. Walking, for those of you who don't know, walking through the 40-inch soaking pits was a quick tour through Dante's Inferno. Dark figures lurking in there, smoke rising, and whistles blowing. Red lights flashing, and then you'd hear, boom! Christ, something happened. Then the wounded would be taken. They're making steel, see?